I'm here with Truther Girl Natasha and reporter Janet Phelan. She's an investigative reporter who specializes in particular in the issue of conservatorship, along with other things, though, as well. And her website is janetphelan.com. That's PHELAN.com. So welcome back, Janet.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much for having both me and Dr. Fettgather on this hour to discuss.
Oh, yeah, so I was going to say, so we're joined also now with Dr. Fettgather, whose son was put under conservatorship. Welcome to the show, Dr. Fettgather.
Thank you, Sonia. Pleasure to be on.
Oh, thanks so much for coming on. So, sorry to interrupt you, Janet. I didn't mean to do that, but so you were saying about, so Dr. Fettgather's son is under one of these conservatorships.
Yes, actually, in the last hour, we had touched upon how governments are, in a sense, separating themselves off from the best interests of their people and acting in ways that are actually attacking their best interests. And these conservatorships, I think, are an excellent example of this. And also how they cloak themselves in the spin that this is all for your own good. Now, just to give a couple of seconds to explain what a conservatorship is for those who may not know, they're generally initiated through court proceedings when there are allegations that a person is not able to handle their own affairs. That could be either through age, like you get old, you can't remember things, or through disability. And in the state of California, when a developmentally disabled child reaches the age of majority, which is 18, he or she has to have a guardian appointed for him. And this is just sort of to kind of set the context for what is happening in Dr. Fettgather's son's situation. So that being said, maybe we can have Dr. Fettgather sort of explain what's going on with his son and how this is the attack, in a sense, on his son is now becoming an attack on him.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, would you like to tell us a bit about your son and how this happened and what's going on now?
Yes. So briefly, David is a 25-year-old young man with Down syndrome, and the attack began, as Janet said, when he had reached the age of majority, and it was upon him. So David's attackers are twofold. One is, as Janet pointed out, a very aggressive conservator and probate community in Sacramento, California. And then also, and this applies to people with developmental disabilities like my son, the State Department of Developmental Disabilities. Its equivalent in New York State, for example, was just run up the ladder by Governor Cuomo for all kinds of violations. But both of these agents really claim ownership of the person. And as Janet knows, they claim ownership of the elderly, conservators do, and they claimed ownership of my son in 2005. And it's especially difficult because there's collusion between the State Department of Developmental Disabilities and with conservators, their lawyers, court investigators. It is an industry, and people often ask me why, and the main driving force is profit. My son is worth a lot of money when he's owned by both the state and by a conservator. And so that's why he's kept from living in his own family home, for example.
Well, what I don't understand is why would they have appointed another adult as his guardian instead of his own parents?
Well, that's a quick answer. So his mom and I were divorced years before. And so we kind of innocently, we knew that we had problems making choices, so we kind of innocently hired a professional fiduciary, that's a conservator, who promised to do the very best for our son. and immediately took ownership of him and did nothing that she promised. And David has been placed first in a very slum-like, dangerous place, and then in another place, which is where he is to this day, which is essentially a home without any stimulation whatsoever. It's vacuous, and this for a young man who needs stimulation. So, and what I have done, as Janet knows, I'm a psychologist. I worked in the disability field for 10 years before David was born. I filed due process protests, complaints that were really well reasoned, I think, and I became a subject of retaliation myself.
So I've had Janet on a few times. We've talked about this and how crooked the whole conservatorship industry really is. That they're really not working in the best interest of the conservatee, but it's just like a racket, a way for them to make money. And so, first of all, I have to say that I can only imagine how horribly heartbreaking and frustrating and angering this must be for you, and I really sympathize with you. And that you're a psychologist, and you could write out a well-reasoned, proposal about why he should be in your care or why the care should be different, and that they would just ignore it and then actually target you, and that's just another aspect of this being a racket. So what are some of the things that they did to target you?
Well, it's from the very beginning. The first tactic of the conservator was, so I made complaints about, the schools, the residential placements, which were absolutely horrendous, and so eventually what she did was she did what I call a reverse of facts defense. She said, well, I didn't, Dr. Fettgather complained about these things, but actually I just wasn't using my best judgment because he was complaining. So, in other words, my complaints caused her decisions. And then, and these guys hired horrendous attorneys. So then, the attorneys just write these long, horribly contentious and, because they can, just lies about me. Horrible father, complainer, will put his son in jeopardy, and even the court investigators who are also involved in this. One court investigator in Sacramento who's required to meet with me didn't even meet me and wrote a very, just basically parroted the attorney for hire, and all that went to the judge, and it was a fait accompli. I was just outcast.
It's terrible.
So, and that, my son and I suffered a lot.
So, Janet, what do you think? Is there a legal recourse for him? It sounds like it's just so corrupt that you just come up against brick walls any way you turn.
Well, you do come up against brick walls, and some of these brick walls are actually written into the probate code. And I just want to bring to the attention of the listening audience that according to, I think it's, here we go, probate code, California probate code section 1970, if you annoy the conservator, for example, by asking too many times to see your family member. If you ask for, 3 times, if you file a petition to see a family member who's under a conservatorship, you can be termed a vexatious litigant, which means you can't even file a lawsuit or appear in court without filing a substantial bond and getting the permission of the judge. And this is, this is almost defies belief. So I'm just encouraging the listening audience. It's California Probate Code 1970. So, that there are roadblocks being put in the way that more and more cement the ownership of the individual who is under conservatorship. You are, first of all, upon the initiation of a conservatorship, you lose most of your rights. You lose all access to your funds, if you have any. So you basically become the property of the guardian. And should a family member start to advocate or even want to see their, in the case of Dr. Fettgather, his son, you can be termed a vexatious litigant and lose your rights to petition for redress. It is really a very bad situation. Now, these conservatorships are happening all over the country. This is certainly not confined to California. I'm aware also that Dr. Fettgather had filed a complaint with the Professional Fiduciaries Bureau. And that bureau, there has been some information that has come to light recently about the illegal sorts of operations of that bureau. But I'd like Dr. Fettgather to give us a little bit of details about what happened to his complaint, how it was handled.
I'd love to, Janet. So this is a new bureau in California. So we have in California a Department of Consumer Affairs that oversees all the professions, including my own. And so the PFB, the Professional Fiduciaries Bureau, is relatively new. So I filed a complaint, and it was, I take my time with this stuff, and what I did was I just went through the relatively new probate code regulations that govern professional fiduciaries, and I listed the statute, and then I listed the violation. So it was that well thought out, and it sat for a long time. I was called by the investigator, or actually probably an analyst, because it never reached an investigation. And what happened then was remarkable to me. And I say this as a psychologist because it would never happen with my board. So the analyst then called the conservator, who simply said, if Dr. Fettgather doesn't like the placement and David's situation, he needs to go back to court. And again, I spent close to $100,000 losing. When Janet Phelan talks about the corruption of the court, people should understand that families lose fortunes and get nowhere. So I'm not going back to court. But the bottom line is that this analyst then called me and said, the professional fiduciary says take it back to court. That's the end. And I was completely in shock because, this agency is supposed to govern the rights of the consumer. This is a consumer-based agency, and yet they were backing the professional fiduciary. It was absolutely egregious.
And also, the Professional Fiduciaries Bureau has issued a number of responses to different people's complaints saying, well, you have to take this to court. You have to adjudicate this in court. And this was brought to the attention in terms of one complaint a couple years ago, because they're not supposed to do that. And immediately when the Professional Fiduciaries Bureau was informed that their analyst had put in writing, well, just take it back to court, well, they reversed their disposition of that complaint. They said, we made a mistake. We'll reopen the complaint, because they are not supposed to do that. So we're finding that they keep telling people to go back to court, which is in complete violation of their mandate. Now, this brings up another interesting, I just want to mention this, and I don't want to detract too much time away from Dr. Fettgather's story, but recently it became so obvious that this Professional Fiduciaries Bureau wasn't following what its mandate was that I went ahead and made a Records Act request, and I wanted to see its policies and procedures manual. And I got a response back from the press officer for that bureau saying, well, we don't have a policies and procedures manual. Now, can you imagine a government agency functioning without written policies and procedures? It's outrageous. In fact, it's not only outrageous, it's illegal. So at that point, I sort of, started moving to contact other interested agencies like the head of the Department of Consumer Affairs. And Rochelle Everhart assured me in a conversation about 3 months ago, when she was informed that they had no written policies and procedures, she said, well, this is outrageous. I'm going to bring the bureau chief into my office, and we're going to find out what's going on there. Well, that was the end of my contact with Rochelle Everhart, because from that point on, she refused to return my phone call. She so she basically tried to protect and cover, the bases so they could continue to function basically rogue. No policies, no procedures. They put everything that they don't like into what I call the round file being the wastebasket. So we have an agency that is very tiny. It only has one full-time analyst and one part-time bureau chief, and they're basically throwing away the complaint, saying go back to court, which is not what the law says it has to do, and there's no way to hold them accountable because they have no written guidelines. This is like Alice in Wonderland.
And on top of that, this also happens with children, like Dr. Fettgather's son. When when the son turned 18, they thought they were doing the right thing by getting a guardian, and they really had no idea what they were getting into. And look what's happening now, and how the system is turned against Dr. Fettgather and his son. So that's why I think it's a really important issue.
I'm back on. I was blacked out for a moment, so I can hear you now. So
I just wanted to say, I think Dr. Fettgather's situation is extremely important because now, as we mentioned earlier on, the system is not only attacking his son, but also now attacking Dr. Fettgather and his very way of making a living, which we're going to get into in a minute. And there's one more thing I wanted to say is that, I know this isn't a sexy story. It deals with old people and people who are infirm and have disabilities. And in America, we kind of tend not to want to look at that. We'd rather, pay attention to the young, the vibrant, the beautiful. But what is so important about this story is that any one of us could go under a conservatorship if we run into the wrong people. All it takes is allegations. You don't have to prove that a person is disabled or infirm or has Alzheimer's. You only have to allege it. So it is also a perfect tool for oppression. It's bad enough that it is happening to people who do have disabilities, as does Dr. Fettgather's son, but any one of us, if we cross a line, could end up in this sort of pickle. And given what is now happening to Dr. Fettgather, I think this story just cries out to be told. So with that being said, I'd like to have Dr. Fettgather talk a little bit, if possible, about the assault that he endured and then what happened after that.
I'd be happy to. So in April of last year, about a year ago, because I made no progress with working with both the court system and also with, as I said, the State Department of Developmental Disabilities. And again, as Janet said earlier, they own my son. My son is property. And I think for listeners to understand that elders and people with disabilities and really anybody can become property in this country is really, or should be, a very scary thought. So I decided to take this to the legislature, and I took it to an assembly member and worked with him for about a year in the most diplomatic way. And finally getting no action, and an assemblyman or senator can do what's called a legislative inquiry, which is all I was asking for. I spoke up on a town hall meeting, and I basically did what we're allowed to do in America, and I said, you promote yourself as a leader in disabilities, and yet you have done nothing for my son, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I was reported by this assemblyman to the state dignitaries unit, and he stated that I accosted him, which was not true. In fact, I was proud of what I had done. And the CHP dignitaries unit came to my own home, and the first words they asked, and I don't even know if Janet knows this, is they said, "Is this the home of Dr. Fettgather, the writer?" Now, I have done some writing, but I'm better known for the psychology that I do. But that's the way these people think. They don't want the word to get out. And so this was initiated by the state assemblyman. And he then took it a step further. He knew that I was passionate about the well-being of my son, yet he let it be known to the state dignitaries unit that he thought my son was possibly in danger. So they contacted the conservator, and then the conservator and her attorney cooked up this huge letter saying that I had shown a violent pattern. So that's how quickly, when I spoke up at a town hall meeting, you get a state assemblyman and a pretty innocent messenger at the CHP. He didn't know. And then, this egregious attorney and conservator. And I had shown a violent pattern, and I was forbidden to take my own son from a horrible care home. And this without a court order. So it's that kind of retaliation. I then took it to the State Department of Developmental Disabilities, and they were recently in California news because of the high number of abuse cases in state hospitals. Because people in state hospitals, like my son, are property, and they are abused routinely. And it is covered up by the state. And so when I brought the attention of the two executives that govern my son's well-being, I was grilled for an hour. I was accused of wanting to kidnap my son. It was horrendous. And my question when I came there was, I want to understand, why David is in such poor condition, and I want to understand what you're doing about it. And they refused to answer that question at all. And then, not only did they kick me out, but and I got some pictures of it. They assaulted me. They grabbed me by the back of my coat and shoved me to the exit. So, the leader of that, this state executive, his salary is $294,000 a year to attack a parent of a kid with a disability. So that's how bad it gets. And I think Janet would also like me to cover these, back to the Department of Consumer Affairs, and we talked about the Professional Fiduciary Bureau. Well, the Department of Consumer Affairs that oversees the PFB, and she talked about being brushed off, is in itself a corrupt agency. So since last April, actually immediately after, and that next May, I was accused by my own, by the DCA, by the Department of Consumer Affairs and my own psychology board, of engaging in some sort of vague, inappropriate behavior. And as it turns out, I had a business dispute many months earlier with some former employees. And even though this is a consumer affairs department, the psychology board, which is, again, under the Department of Consumer Affairs, reached over into this business dispute, which is irrelevant. It had nothing to do with consumers, and has spent the last year formulating an attack against my license and is attempting to take my license away and take my livelihood away.
Really?
So,
they were trying to do that to you because, as an extension of this?
Yeah, that's how.
God.
That's the current status.
I'd like to just jump in for a second, because when I heard this, I contacted the state psychology board, because they put up some of their documents concerning Dr. Fettgather and the attack on his license. They put them up on their website, and the documents they put up are somewhat vague. They said there have been 4 complaints. Well, I have the exact names of the people who complained against Dr. Fettgather, all of whom are former employees.
So, Dr. Fettgather, I just wanted to ask you about the conditions of the place where your son was kept, because I've learned recently that this is a really big problem, what goes on with institutions, and that up until 1996, even in Canada, they had these huge warehouse-like institutions where people were treated, really worse than animals. And I know this kind of topic must be really painful to you because your son has been in these institutions. I'm hoping that it's better than it was up until, just recently, but that people were being really seriously neglected, not fed, not cleaned, not cared for, strapped down and things like that. So I don't know. I hope it's improved. I know in Canada they shut a lot of those kind of places down. Incredible stuff used to happen at the Allen Memorial here also. But what was it like in the place where he was being supposedly taken care of?
Well, the history of institutions in the United States is also egregious, and institutional reform began back in the 70s with Willowbrook and in New York. But I think one of the most important notes is that as recently as maybe a month ago, Governor Cuomo came out with a scathing report, which he initiated, and this is based on a New York Times expose and the kind of thing that we'd like to see nationwide, that institutions were still engaged in many of these practices. Many institutions have been closed, but they've been replaced by board and care homes, which are really mini institutions, and where the same practices go on, and sometimes with even less monitoring. It should be noted that the state saves money because to keep a person in an institution, even in abysmal care, is costly. To keep a person in a board and care home, which is their replacement, is pennies on the dollar. So the state's all for it. And so David was put initially into something called a mentor home, which is just a real manipulation of the law. To start a mentor home, all you need is a house anywhere, and this was in a slum. The crime rate was through the roof, according to Sacramento police mapping, with a babysitter, and that was his care home. And the babysitter was later caught moonlighting, dragging David around to other houses. He was sleeping in his own bed. So since then, and it took mountains. The state wanted to keep him there to get him moved, but he's just been moved to a place where, if you can imagine, neglect, where he goes to bed at 5:30 p.m. in the summertime. It's very light in Sacramento, California, where he gained a lot of weight on a high fructose corn syrup diet, where he's gotten inconsistent medical care, and where he's gotten such a lack of stimulation that he's actually developed autistic-like characteristics, which for a sociable Down syndrome person is torture. And many people have likened these conditions that you're talking about to torture, and the point is they still exist.
Mm-hmm. And I know that children with Down syndrome, there's a very wide range of what their functioning can be, and people tend to think Down syndrome, well, they don't do very much. But I've known some who are very well socialized and who are just really lovable, happy kids. Other than that, they have this disability, but that doesn't make them any less lovable and, sensitive, than any other human being. And if anything, they need more care, they need more attention, and more love because they're a little bit more like younger children.
Well, Sonia, you're putting a smile on that father's face, and David, on the other hand, has received the opposite for now 7 years. He's become stressed, depressed. 2 attorneys inadvertently said that he suffered from trauma, and yet he stays in the same place. And so that is a kind of a brief answer to your question. And it is a nationwide problem. And, as Janet knows, you can go to convalescent hospitals and care homes, and you just look at marginalized people in our culture, and you will find them tortured or in some way owned.
And what I think is so telling about this is the state obviously has developed a mechanism for determining which people are non-people, people who have no rights, people who can be taken from their family, whose assets can be drained, and who can be treated essentially as property. And the fact that such a loophole and mechanism exists should be intolerable to anybody. Because anybody can fall into that loophole based on allegations alone. And the fact that our most vulnerable citizens, our disabled children, our elderly, are being essentially, I like the word torture, because actually if you read the convention, Geneva Convention about torture, it applies pretty much to the T to what's happening to many of these people under these conservatorships. If it's okay, Sonia, I'd like to go back just a minute to this issue with the State Psychology Board and their attempts to take away Dr. Fettgather's means of employment, his means of generating income.
And also, Janet, too, my means of advocating for my son, because this is the way to stop me.
Very good. Very good point. Yes, absolutely. It is, because, of course, if they dry up his income, then they basically dry up his advocacy efforts as well. And so after I had spoken initially with Dr. Fettgather and also his attorney about what was happening, I followed up and looked at what the State Psychology Board had put on their website, and it's very disturbing. But the complainants aren't named. They're protecting the privacy of the complainants, but of course not the privacy of Dr. Fettgather. So I contacted the State Psychology Board and I said, look, these are the names of the 4 complainants, and they're all former employees. I said, is it the policy of the State Psychology Board to involve themselves in employer-employee disputes? And the woman, whose name is Gina Bayliss, said, oh, no, we don't do that. I said, well, look, this is what you've done. Oh, well, I can't comment on that. All the information I can give you is what's on the website, which once again is deleterious to Dr. Fettgather's reputation, but doesn't name the accusers and doesn't give any indication that they weren't consumers. So I find this to be another sort of evidence of this machine that is gobbling people up in these conservatorships and also gobbling up people who try to protect the rights of the property of the state. And I just want to take a minute. If people are concerned about this, I think there's a sense of helplessness that a lot of us feel, with what's going on in the country. But we can do something about this case. And I want to give out the phone number for the California Board of Psychology. You can go online and you can see what they're doing to Dr. Fettgather yourself. And if you're concerned about all this and what you've heard on this show, I urge you to call them and express yourself. And I'm going to give 2 phone numbers. One's the local, it's a number in California. It's 916-263-2699. You ask for Gina Bayliss. She's the woman I spoke with. And once again, 916-263-2699. And the toll-free number is 866-503-3221. 866-503-3221. And I just want to mention that what's happening here to Dr. Fettgather, there's a similar situation going on now in Florida with a medical doctor, Dr. Robert Sarhan, who is also now being ground up by the system, has lost his ability to generate his own income. People who defend the rights of loved ones in conservatorships are being treated with, I will say, measured brutality by the state, and we can do something about this. We can call.
Yeah, and that, I put that number in the chat room as well. And please, everyone, give your support to Dr. Fettgather and other people who have been victimized by this, and of course the conservatives by speaking out and spreading the word about this and calling those numbers. Thank you so much for joining me. and for joining me in the chat, and we'll see you next week.